Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at this Eduard limited edition Wilde BF109G-6. Some superbly funky schemes in this one, so let's see how I get on. Hope you enjoy. So then, if you are a loyal Mac model subscriber, you will realise that this is the second BF109 I've done in a row. And because of this, I've definitely learned from my mistakes in the first video, and one of those mistakes was the rudder pedals. So for this video, I'm very happy to inform you that I've orientated them the right way around, and it is completely historically accurate. Continuing the build up of the cockpit, here you can see me securing the backplate for the seat in place. Basic off of the sprue offerings for this kit is superb. There is sublime detail, and really I have not seen myself needing to use any of the photo etch yet. The overall fitment of the cockpit and this kit in general is honestly world class. This means a very speedy build up of the cockpit, leading me to get onto paint very quickly. And the first colour to go onto this build is Mr. Color's C116, which is their rendition of RLM66. To spray this colour down, I'm going to be thinning it in a ratio of 40% paint to 60% thinner, and spraying down at about 1 bar, which is the equivalent of 15 to 16 psi. The RLM66 give me a brilliant base to go and do some detail painting. To do the detail painting, I'm going to be using a variety of colours from Ammo Mig's range of paints. This includes black, yellow, red, white, along with a couple of metallic elements. Once they are all picked out, I can then seal everything in using a Mr. Color spray can of flat varnish. Funnily enough, this spray can isn't superbly flat, but it does give me quite a nice satin or semi-gloss finish, which I can then use a pin wash on. I use a pin wash for two main purposes. Firstly, to create some fake shadows, and secondly, to create some nice grimy streaks and add a bit of texture to that quite flat base of RLM66. Wherever I personally feel there's just a little bit too much of a build up of that dark wash, I will come in with a flat headed brush doused in a little bit of white spirit and start to dab and pull that away. As the wash is being pulled away, I'm going to be using a stippling motion to create that modulated effect on the other grey aspects of the cockpit. I was making sure to be very careful not to oversaturate my brush with white spirit here, as if I did do that I would potentially dilute the wash down just a little bit too much. Because I want this to be a little bit more of a dirty bird, if you do excuse me, I need to use an oil brusher here just to enhance some areas. As you can see on the clip, I did go a little bit over the top with the amount of oil that I was using. As this cockpit is quite a small area, I would recommend using far less than what I used. To counteract this, what I had to do was dilute my brush in a little bit more white spirit than I personally would have liked. However, with a little bit of persistence and about 20 minutes later of mucking around with oils, I was quite happy with how it was looking. To speed up the drying process of these oils, I'm going to be using my trusty dusty heat gun. As you can see on screen, it just evaporates all of that white spirit much quicker, leaving the desired modulated grimy looking paint underneath. One tool which I do think is quite understated in the modelling world is the heat gun. If you are looking to speed up your drying processes for oil paints and other little bits and bobs, I would recommend potentially having a look at getting one of these heat guns. Now that I personally think the cockpit is looking suitably grimy, I just want to add a little bit of texture to it, and to do that I'm going to be using some pigments, specifically air-filled dust pigment. I'm using the pigment just to add a little bit of texture and another dimension to the grime in the cockpit. My pigment brush of choice to manipulate it is actually an old brush which I've just cut a lot of the ends off, and this just makes it much stiffer and much easier to move the pigments around the cockpit. So if you have an old brush which you don't mind sacrificing and decapitating, I'd recommend doing the same, as it made my life a lot easier. Something which unfortunately I forgot to film but I did use was a little bit of pigment fixer just to keep all of these pigments in place and keep them looking fresh. With that out of the way, here was the finished sidewall, I guess, of the cockpit. I was really quite happy with how this looked, and it just shows how just a couple of layers of different oils and pigments really can transform a cockpit. Turning the attention back to the actual cockpit tub, I can fasten the seatbelts into place, no pun intended, and then secure this pod into one side of the fuselage. The sidewalls of the fuselage have some nice locating pins, so fitment is superb. One component which didn't unfortunately manage to get any screen time, but was there, was the very nice instrument panel included with photo etch by Eduard. It builds up very nicely and looks really busy. Hopefully next time I do a 109 I'll remember to film it. You might have just seen me showing off my latest filling product. and that is Mr. Hobby's Dissolved Putty, and honestly this stuff is an absolute game changer. For me personally, I've been using Flexi CA and Superglue for almost my entire modelling career to fill in gaps. Don't get me wrong, it works, but it always runs the risk of cracking and it's quite an unstable agent. But after using this stuff, it was great. It didn't sink at all. It also provided a really nice base for any of the rescribing which I had to do. You might have seen that I had my riveter out, as Eduard models do have quite a few rivets, so I always like to try and rescribe them if I can, and it provided a really nice solid base for all of that rescribing. Bringing our attention back to the build at hand, here you can see me securing in these flame dampeners into place. These are made out of photo etch and I secured them with some Flexi CA VMS superglue. They looked really good and they were holding in place quite well for the majority of the build until it came to putting the exhaust stubs into place. Both of those photo etch parts were catapulted across the room, and I mean like at stupid speeds. Like, I'm surprised it didn't take my blimmin' eye out. So the question I have for you, yes you watching this video, is how would you have approached this differently? As I am absolutely loving the 109 at the moment, I'm sure that I might have to do something like this again, and really I would like to have them secured onto the aircraft. So if you could let me know down below, I would be really appreciative. So on screen you can now see me securing the upper and the lower halves of the wing. This is really a painless process and does not have any issues at all, but it does take a little bit of time and a few clamps just to keep everything in place so you have a really nice secure fit. Once I've repeated that process, the wing assembly can be cemented to the fuselage. As I mentioned last video, this has a very nice fit and does not need any filler to sort out any wing root gaps, which honestly is great. It's absolutely great. Keeping my focus of attention around the wings, I can now fit on some flaps and also some radiator aspects and elements. The joy of doing two builds back to back, in my opinion, is really all the issues that you did in that last build are so fresh in your mind that you pay extra close attention to those aspects. One of them in particular, in my opinion, was the flaps. The flaps angles on my previous BF109 F2 I think were just a little bit off. The angles just did not seem to line up. So for this one I was particularly careful to make sure that I personally thought they were exactly how they should be. The headrest can be very carefully glued in place before then the glass being secured into place. This is just done with a little bit of PVA glue, as I like to keep my canopies removable, as you know, last time there was a bit of varnish. I think I called it something differently, but varnish pretty much got underneath the canopy and I had to remove it to get rid of it. So this time I was just making sure that really if anything did get underneath, it would be very easily removed. The canopy can then be masked off and I can spray some RLM66 to display or simulate those inner struts of the canopy being the same colour as the interior. And finally I can go on to doing the main bit of painting, but before then, what I do have to do is actually prime the model. After my success last time with the spray can variant of Mr. Finishing Surfacer, I'm going to use it again. This gave me a great base for RLM66 or Mr. Colours C117. Like earlier, this was sprayed down in 40% paint to 60% Mr. Leveling Thinner and around about 1 bar. Once it had completely dried, it looked so cool. I genuinely think this colour is one of my favourite ever. It's absolutely beautiful. But it did show up one thing which I didn't notice before, and that is that the rear spine, its seam had unfortunately been filled in by the aerosol can. The downside to aerosols is you don't have too much control on paint flow. A little bit annoying, but next time I'll just spray a little bit further away. So to carry out the unique and almost selling point of this scheme, which is going to be the squiggles all across it, it is so unique and I absolutely love it. To perform these squiggles, there was only one airbrush for the job, and that airbrush was the Pro Convoy. I've used this quite a few times now, and its accuracy and pinpoint fine line spraying is exactly what I needed to carry out this scheme. Don't get me wrong, I did have to go over each of these squiggles quite a few times to get the desired thickness, but overall I was quite happy with it, with the exception of 1 or 2 places where I either sneezed or I slipped a little bit on the trigger. But don't get me wrong, that is nothing to do with the brush, that is just down to me. A lot of people have definitely been asking about the brush and where you can get them, and if you are from the UK and specifically around the London area, I recommend making a trip down to Hannon's. It's very rare in this day and age that you can actually go into a shop and feel the physical product, especially when it comes to something as vital as your airbrush. So if you're looking to step up your modelling game and potentially you need an airbrush, definitely pay Hannants London a visit. Their details are on screen now. They have a lovely variety of airbrushes, and I'm sure there's at least one down there which will suit your needs perfectly. I usually go to Hannants every Sunday morning, so if you want to pay me a visit, you'll know where I'll be. With the general squiggles and complex elements of this scheme out of the way, I can now turn my attention to some more basic aspects, which is just masking off the lovely RLM 23 band on the tail, and also the RLM 02 green slate aspects, which it's almost like the primer colour for Luftwaffe aircraft. This was masked off using some Tamiya masking tape, both the flexible and also the basic masking tape. I guess it's just basic, it's sticky. And with this piece on screen peeled off, really, that was the basic painting all sorted. Something that I did want to add to this build was some chipping. A very experienced gentleman in the Luftwaffe field did critique my BF109 F2 from about 2 weeks ago, and a criticism was the lack of chipping. So to replicate this, I used a very dark metallic colour, almost a black, and just sponge chipped some onto the wings where the crew would be getting on and off. To seal in all of those lovely squiggles, I'm going to be using a semi-gloss varnish. This acts as firstly a sealant, but then also a great base for all of the decals. The decals went down superbly, even better than last time. I made sure to really hammer on that Mr. Solvent or Mr. Sol sort of solution, and all of the decals conformed honestly flawlessly. At this stage, I can cement a couple more sub-assemblies on. Specifically, you can see on screen I'm cementing on the front spinner. It looks very, very cool with its nice yellow tip, and then everything can once again be sealed in the semi-gloss varnish. So now on to some weathering. So the first bit of weathering that I'm going to be doing is using a dark wash over the entirety of the top side of the aircraft. Once that has been left to dry for about 10-15 minutes, it can be wiped off and hopefully leaving all of the excess in the panel lines and also the rivets. Last build, I opted for the use of shaders to highlight all of these panel and rivet lines. For this build, I chose not to, as I didn't want to conflict with the squiggles. The squiggles are very, very curvy, and the panel and rivet lines are very, very straight, and I thought that would just be a little bit too busy. If you agree or disagree, let me know. To break up that rather bland and monotone black on the underside, I'm going to be using a light grey wash just to break that up. I must say I'm very happy with the results, but as mentioned to me by someone else, I definitely think I could have gone a little bit lighter on that wash. To secure all of the oil and the panel washes and whatnot in, I'm going to be using the flat varnish or semi-gloss varnish as used earlier in the cockpit. Something which I thought just looked a little bit out of place was how pristine and perfect the exhaust stubs were looking. So to counteract this, I'm going to be using a light grey oil paint and just dabble and stippling it onto the tips of each of the individual stubs. I'm just trying to blend them back here and give almost this burnt and sooty effect on the tips of them. This worked quite well, don't get me wrong, but I think what I'm going to do next time I do a 109 is I'm going to actually just try and paint and use almost some post-shading effects to create a little bit more of a convincing effect. But for this current stage of the build, I was quite happy with the outcome. Another addition which I definitely could have done and probably should have done is putting some pigments on the tips of all of these as well. I think it just would have added a little bit of texture and a bit more to the effect. Speaking of soot and grime and all of that sort of shebang, it's time for me to put on my exhaust stains. To do this, I'm going to just mix up a 70-30 mix of grey to brown, making sure that there is more grey than brown. This can then be very heavily diluted, almost 80% thinner to 20% paint, and then using the Pro Convoy again, I'm going to just create a sort of outline of the shape that I want it to be, and then really enhance the paint and make it a little bit more opaque around the tips of the exhaust. Onto the final stages of assembly now. The landing gear legs can be secured on, making sure that they're in the right position. I did have a little bit of an issue with one of the legs being warped. I tried to unwarp it or get it into the correct shape using a heat gun. Not perfect, but definitely a lot better than it was. The underlying fuel tank can also be popped on now, and the masks can be removed. Like deja vu from about 2 weeks ago, there is shit under the canopy. Surprise, surprise. But as the canopy has been left unglued, it is very easy to sort out just by yanking the canopy off, using a little cotton bud and getting rid of any of the varnish or shit, as I like to call it. Something to be very careful of when removing the canopy is not to apply too much pressure. I must say, if you put too much pressure through this, I think you definitely run the risk of snapping the canopy in two. Eduard have a superb part replacement service, but I wouldn't want you to utilise it this close to the end of a build. Once it has been demasked and also de-shitted, I can then push it back into place, once again not using any glue because I kind of want to open one of these canopies up in the future and potentially do a diorama. But with the rigging secured, that is this build finished. Quick note before we get onto the final photos and videos, I do in fact have a new camera, so if you could let me know what you think of the quality of this upcoming clip, I would really appreciate it. And with that, that is my take on a Wilde scheme. So enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time guys. Bye bye.